Somewhere beneath a city that refuses to die, 52,000 people are pressed into underground tunnels, listening to the world above them come apart. Mothers are counting heads in the dark, children are sleeping on concrete platforms, and above them, the sky is being torn open by something that has no name in peacetime. This is not a story about one night. This is a story about what happens when the math of modern warfare finally catches up with the promises of modern diplomacy. And tonight, those two things are not even close to matching. Let me tell you what actually happened, what it means, and why the people making decisions in the most powerful capitals on Earth are hoping you never connect these dots. By the time rescue crews begin pulling rubble from what used to be a 9-story apartment building, 21 people are confirmed dead. That number will climb. It always climbs. Floor by floor, the crews are answering a question that nobody wanted asked. A 9-year-old girl and her family are still somewhere inside that building when the search enters its second day. 800,000 books have burned in a warehouse. Animals in a children's zoo have been injured in their enclosures. And somewhere far away, men in expensive rooms are looking at casualty figures not with grief, but with what I can only describe as calculation. Not moral calculation, strategic calculation, leverage calculation. I need you to understand something before we go any further. This particular strike was not random. It was not impulsive. It was not even, despite what official statements will tell you, simply retaliatory. What happened over that city was the product of a decision-making process that has been building for months, and it connects directly to a war being fought on the other side of the planet that most people watching this have never been asked to think about in the same breath. Russia's defense ministry released a statement almost immediately after the attack. The language was clinical. They described the operation as a response to a sustained campaign by Ukrainian forces against Russian oil infrastructure. And here's the thing, that part is actually true. Ukraine has been running what its own president called a 40-day blitz against Russian refineries, pumping stations, and energy facilities, hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. Just hours before the massive strike, Ukrainian forces had hit a major oil refinery complex, roughly 1,500 kilometers from the front lines. Russia's fuel supply chains are under genuine stress. There are real shortages in parts of Russia. The economic pressure is measurable. So on the surface, the retaliation narrative holds together. You hit our economy, we hit your capital. That is the stated logic. But here is where I want you to stop accepting the surface. Russia has been targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure since the earliest weeks of the full-scale invasion, long before Ukraine had the capability to reach deep into Russian territory at all. The entire framing of retaliation is doing something very specific. It is borrowing the moral language of the second mover to cover actions that the first mover already normalized years ago. It is one of the oldest tricks in the entire history of asymmetric warfare. And the press releases are written knowing most people will not look up the timeline. But even if you accept Moscow's logic completely, even if you grant every part of their justification at face value, there is still a question sitting at the center of this story that I cannot let go of. Why this scale? We are talking about nearly 500 drones and more than 70 missiles, including hypersonic weapons, directed at a single city in a single night. Ukrainian officials are calling it one of the largest single attacks of the entire war. So the question is not whether Russia decided to retaliate. The question is why Russia decided to retaliate with everything it had at once. And to answer that, I have to take you somewhere that sounds completely unrelated. There is a concept that military historians keep returning to when they study the air campaigns of the 20th century. It goes back to theorists writing in the years between the two world wars. Men who believed that if you concentrated enough destructive force against an enemy's capital, against the nerve center of a nation's will to resist, you could break something that years of grinding battlefield attrition simply cannot break. They called it the knockout blow. The idea that civilian infrastructure, civilian morale, the sheer accumulated terror of living under sustained bombardment, could fracture a society's capacity to keep fighting faster than any army ever could. This theory has never really worked the way its architects imagined. It did not break London in 1940. It did not break Hanoi in the early 70s. And 4.5 years into this conflict, there is essentially no evidence that it is breaking the population that has been hiding in subway tunnels long enough to have built an entire second life underground. And yet, the strategy keeps returning, war after war, generation after generation, because the men who order these strikes are not actually betting on breaking people's spirits. They are betting on something slower and more mechanical. They are betting on exhausting the systems designed to protect those people. And this is where the story leaves Kyiv entirely and becomes something much bigger, something that I think is the actual engine underneath everything happening right now. Let me explain interceptor economics, because I promise you this is the most important thing in this entire conversation, and almost nobody is explaining it clearly. A Patriot missile system, specifically its PAC-3 interceptor round, is currently the only weapon in Ukraine's entire arsenal capable of reliably shooting down an incoming ballistic missile. Not drones. Ukraine has gotten reasonably effective at knocking down the Shahed-style attack drones, intercepting the vast majority on most nights. But a ballistic missile operates on completely different physics. It comes down from the upper atmosphere at speeds that turn interception into one of the most difficult engineering problems that exists. Only a handful of systems anywhere on Earth can solve it consistently. Patriot is one of them. On the night of the massive attack, Ukraine's Air Force publicly admitted that the interception rate against ballistic and hypersonic weapons was unusually low. Not because the operators failed, not because the systems malfunctioned, but because Ukraine has been running short on Patriot interceptors for months. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. That shortage is not only about Western governments being slow or stingy, though there is plenty of both. It is about something more fundamental. It is about a physical resource that has become genuinely scarce across the entire Western alliance simultaneously. Because those same PAC-3 interceptors that Ukraine desperately needs over its cities are also the backbone of a completely separate air defense campaign happening thousands of miles away. The American-led operation against Iran, which has been running since earlier this year, every interceptor round fired or pre-positioned to protect American assets and allied cities from Iranian missiles, is a round that does not exist for Ukraine. This is not a figure of speech. This is literal, physical, industrial scarcity. There are factories in the American Southwest building these interceptors. They can only build so many per month. Those production lines were designed for a world that was not simultaneously running two active air wars on opposite sides of the globe. And right now, in the summer we are living through, the largest defense industrial base in the world is being asked to do exactly that. Supply two allies fighting two separate wars while also maintaining its own strategic reserves. Something has to give. And what we watched happen over that city on that night is what something has to give looks like when you translate it from a budget spreadsheet into human terms. 21 confirmed dead, a family buried in rubble, a 9-year-old girl whose name the rescue crews are hoping to hear called from somewhere underneath the concrete. Ukraine's president visited the destroyed apartment building in the Darnitsky district. 64 apartments erased in a single strike, an entire vertical cross-section of ordinary lives. And he did something that Ukrainian leadership has learned to do after years of this. He converted grief into a specific, quantified political demand. He said Ukraine would need at least 140 Patriot interceptors to reliably stop an attack involving around 70 ballistic missiles. Not more support in general terms, a specific number. And then he said something that I think is one of the most honest things a wartime leader has said in this entire conflict. He said, "We are fighting on our own. The casualties are exclusively Ukrainian. We simply need our partners to do what they agreed to do. We are not even asking for more." Read that again slowly. We are not even asking for more. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a man communicating, as plainly as the language of diplomacy allows, that contracts signed in conference rooms are not being honored fast enough to prevent deaths in residential buildings, and that he has stopped pretending otherwise. Within hours, Ukraine's defense minister took an extraordinary step. He contacted nearly 40 partner countries and asked them not for new pledges, but to physically hand over Patriot interceptors currently sitting in their own national stockpiles, in exchange for replacement deliveries from contracts already signed. Think about what that actually means. He is asking Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, and dozens of others to temporarily lower their own air defenses, to accept increased risk to their own skies in order to close the gap over Ukrainian cities right now. That is not a routine request. That is a signal of how close to the edge the entire system has come. And there is a second pressure point running alongside the interceptor shortage that I think deserves more attention than it gets. For months now, on the sidelines of major summits, Ukraine has been pushing its Western partners for something more permanent than aid shipments. The ask is for production licenses, not another delivery of missiles. The actual blueprint, the technology transfer that would allow Ukraine or a European industrial consortium working with Ukraine to manufacture Patriot interceptors domestically, at scale, without competing for space on an American production line that is also serving an entirely different war. If you think about what that request actually represents, it is historically significant. Handing over the production rights to one of the most sophisticated air defense systems ever built is not something the United States has done casually with any ally ever. It would mean the Western alliance has made a fundamental decision about Ukraine's status. Not a client being kept alive on a supply drip, but an integrated industrial partner inside the Western defense ecosystem, the way South Korea or Israel eventually became partners rather than simply recipients. According to Ukraine's president, there was a positive response to this idea when it was raised at a recent major summit. But positive response and signed agreement are separated by a distance that Ukrainian officials have learned, painfully, to never assume is short. They have watched that gap become the space where people die while waiting for paperwork. There is an upcoming NATO summit where air and missile defense has been explicitly named as a required outcome. And the language Ukraine's president used to frame the stakes was not the language of someone confident in his alliance. It was the language of someone who has watched the distance between what is promised and what is delivered become the single most decisive variable in how many of his citizens survive each week. I want to ask an uncomfortable question because I think it is the most important one underneath all of this. Is the slow pace of Western weapons delivery actually a failure of political will? Or is it something more uncomfortable than that? Is it an honest reflection of physical industrial limits that no one in the Western capitals wants to say out loud? Because if it is the second thing, if the West genuinely cannot produce enough interceptors to simultaneously arm Ukraine, support operations against Iran, and maintain its own strategic reserves, then every summit communiqué, every strongly worded statement, every pledge signed with cameras rolling is, in a certain sense, theater constructed on top of an industrial ceiling that diplomacy cannot raise. You cannot negotiate your way past a factory that produces a fixed number of missiles per month. The ceiling is real, and it does not respond to speeches. I think part of what makes this particular night so significant in the longer arc of this war is that it arrived at the exact moment this contradiction became impossible to paper over. The math finally showed through the language. Look at the wider context. Ukraine's sustained campaign against Russian oil infrastructure has been genuinely effective, causing real fuel shortages and putting measurable pressure on Russian military logistics. At the same time, Russia's ground offensive has been producing only a fraction of the territorial gains it achieved at the same point in previous years. In other words, on the battlefield and in the economic shadow war beneath the battlefield, Russia is not winning at the pace its strategy requires. And when a state cannot win on the ground and cannot win economically, it reaches for whatever lever remains. Historically, across dozens of conflicts in the modern era, that lever is almost always the same one: mass strikes on civilian infrastructure. Not to achieve a military objective in the traditional sense, but to achieve a psychological and political one. To make the cost of continued resistance feel unbearable, not just to the people enduring it, but to the governments and populations in other countries who are funding and arming that resistance. This is where the phrase escalation versus negotiation, which gets thrown around constantly in headlines, actually misdiagnoses what is happening. Because this strike is not a choice between escalating the war or opening peace talks. Ukraine's president has proposed direct negotiations with Russia more than once. Moscow has rejected every approach without serious engagement. What this attack represents is Russia trying to reshape the conditions of a negotiation that has not started yet, trying to inflict enough accumulated pain that when talks eventually do occur, Ukraine arrives at that table having already internalized a level of civilian suffering that shifts what it believes is an acceptable settlement. It is coercive diplomacy conducted entirely through the absence of diplomacy. You do not need to sit at the table if you can determine what your opponent believes they can survive demanding. The United Nations Secretary General issued a statement condemning the attacks and repeating his appeal for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire. He has made this exact appeal dozens of times since the full-scale invasion began. It has not produced a ceasefire once. I say that not to dismiss the importance of that appeal, but to illustrate something about the architecture of the international order this war has been quietly dismantling. The institutions built after the Second World War to prevent exactly this kind of sustained bombardment of civilian centers were constructed on an assumption of enforceability, an assumption that collective consequence would eventually constrain even the most powerful actors. What repeated nights like this one demonstrate, cumulatively, is that when a nuclear-armed permanent member of the Security Council decides that collective consequence is a price worth paying, the institutional architecture designed to prevent that decision has essentially nothing left to offer except language. The Secretary General can appeal, he cannot compel. And the 52,000 people who spent the night in subway tunnels know the difference between those two things more intimately than anyone. I want to come back to the human scale before we finish, because it is easy to get so absorbed in the mechanics of production lines and alliance politics that the actual weight of what happened disappears. An elderly woman was filmed walking through the rubble of her home after the all clear. She was saying nothing, just walking through what used to be her rooms, the way people move when the magnitude of a loss has not yet caught up with the fact of it. Ukraine's Red Cross announced that its central warehouse had been destroyed, along with roughly $2 million worth of humanitarian aid intended for people exactly like her. At a professional tennis tournament in England that same period, a Ukrainian player refused to shake hands with her Russian opponent after their match. A small, silent gesture on a completely different continent that tells you something about how total this conflict has become, how far it has seeped from the front lines into the texture of ordinary life everywhere. So where does this leave us? I do not think a single night, however catastrophic, changes the fundamental trajectory of a war this long. Wars that have run this many years rarely pivot on individual events. But what a night like this does is function as an X-ray. It reveals the skeleton underneath the diplomatic language that usually keeps these contradictions covered. It reveals that two separate active conflicts on opposite sides of the globe are now directly competing for the same finite pool of the same specific weapon, which means they are no longer separate stories told in separate segments of separate newscasts. They are the same story told from two different addresses. It reveals that Ukraine's leadership has made a conscious shift in tone over years of this, from gratitude for whatever arrives to something closer to an accountant demanding that partners honor invoices already submitted. We are not asking for more, just what was agreed. And it reveals that Russia's core strategy, whatever justification it applies on any specific night, has remained unchanged since the earliest days of this war. When you cannot win the conflict you are fighting, you make the conflict more expensive for everyone else to continue. Next week, there is a major NATO summit. We will find out whether the answer to that strategy is another round of carefully worded commitments or something with a production timeline and a signature attached to it. Whether the manufacturing licenses that have been requested for months finally move from positive reaction to actual decision. Whether the alliance builds something real or constructs something that looks real from far enough away. Because if this war has taught us anything over 4.5 years of watching the gap between announcement and delivery, it is that the gap is where the real story always lives. Not in the speeches, not in the communiques, in the space between what is promised and what actually arrives. In the months between the signing and the shipment. In the floors of a collapsed building where a rescue crew is still counting to find out how many people the gap cost this time. That is the story worth following. And it is not finished.